So here's what's happening right now, and I need you to understand just how important this is because what it means is shocking. We're watching right now the slow falling apart of the very structure that holds the Russian Federation together. And it's not happening because of some outside power. Well, not completely. It's happening because Vladimir Putin made a terrible mistake when he started his full attack on Ukraine. Let me go back and explain this to you, because the details are important here. The Chechnya problem, Putin's old mistake, coming back to hurt him. Cue it him. On December 5th, a Ukrainian drone hit a government building in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. This wasn't just any building. This was the building that holds the Chechen Security Council and other important government offices. The day before that, Ukrainian forces hit an FSB building and a Chechen Special Forces military base in the same area. Now, if you're not familiar with the history here, let me give you the background you need to understand why this is such a big deal. Chechnya is not just another part of Russia. Chechnya is the foundation of Putin's entire political identity. It was the Second Chechen War, the harsh, terrible conflict that began in 1999 that allowed Vladimir Putin to secure his power as Russia's leader. He built his entire reputation on the promise of complete control over this area. The war was horribly violent. Grozny was turned into ruins. The human cost was shocking. But Putin presented himself as the strong man who could bring order to chaos, who could keep Russia together when it threatened to break apart. And now, 25 years later, Ukrainian drones are hitting government buildings in Grozny without being stopped. Think about what that means. Think about the message that sends. After those strikes, Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen leader, Putin's chosen enforcer in the region, released a statement. He was clearly shaken. He called the Ukrainian forces devils. He claimed they had destroyed military buildings, machinery, a drone factory. He insisted they had accomplished nothing, that they had only broken some windows. And then he promised harsh revenge within 24 hours. That was 4 days ago. There has been no revenge, but here's what I want you to notice. It was Kadyrov who made that statement, not Putin, not the Kremlin, Kadyrov. Because even though Chechnya is officially part of the Russian Federation, it operates with a large amount of independence. The Chechen people do not mainly think of themselves as Russian. They think of themselves as Chechen first. There were 2 wars fought over this. Wars in which Chechnya tried to gain independence after the fall of the Soviet Union. Putin used overwhelming violence to prevent that independence, but he never truly made Chechnya part of Russia. It remains an independent region ruled by Kadyrov with an iron fist, but independent nonetheless. And there are Chechen groups both inside the region and in exile that are still fighting for Chechen independence. One of those groups responded directly to Kadyrov's statement. Their message was sharp and personal. They reminded Kadyrov that it was Putin who killed his father. They reminded him that it was Russia that killed the Chechen people. They pointed out that when Kadyrov sent Chechen forces to fight in Ukraine, he should have known there would be consequences. They challenged him to meet them, to look them in the eyes, to stop making empty threats. This is exactly what keeps Vladimir Putin awake at night. The possibility that the Chechen people will truly remember that it was Putin who destroyed their homeland, that it was Putin who killed their families, and that it is Putin once again who is getting Chechens killed in a war they never asked for in a country they have no argument with for goals that serve only Moscow's imperial ambitions. The air defense betrayal. Moscow first, everyone else never. Now, let's talk about why these Ukrainian strikes are even possible. Let's talk about air defenses, because this is where Putin's priorities become crystal clear. Putin has taken away the entire country's air defense systems to protect one place, Moscow. He has created a ring of air defense installations around the capital city. Moscow, with its 13 million residents, is protected. The other 120 million Russians living outside Moscow, they're on their own. I want you to think about what that means from a government perspective. The president of your country is clearly telling you that your life is worth less than the lives of people who live in the capital, that the city where you live, the region where you were born, the place where your children go to school, that place doesn't matter enough to defend. Only Moscow matters. This isn't guessing. We can see it in the facts. Ukrainian drones and missiles hit targets throughout Russia, especially in border regions in places like Chechnya with growing frequency and success. Why? Because there are no air defenses to stop them. They've all been moved to Moscow. Imagine being a Russian citizen in Yakutsk or Yekaterinburg or Grozny and watching this happen. Imagine understanding that your government has made a deliberate decision that you are disposable. The economic collapse when the money runs out. But it's not just air defenses. The regional budgets are falling apart. The infrastructure is crumbling. And the reason is simple. All the money is going to the war. Let me give you a specific example. The Sakha Republic, also known as Yakutia, is located in Siberia. This region produces approximately 80% of Russia's diamonds. Russia's diamond industry creates $4 billion in revenue every single year. That means Yakutia is producing enormous value for the Russian state. And what do the people of Yakutia get in return? There's video footage of residents lining up in huge lines to collect food that's literally lying on the ground. This is not a single incident. This is a pattern playing out across Russia's regions. The Kremlin's own state media, the propaganda machine that normally shows nothing but positive stories about Russian strength and wealth, is now reporting on regional budgets running out of money and infrastructure falling apart. In Angarsk in the Irkutsk region, there was an accident at a power station. More than 167,000 people were left without heating. The temperature forecast was minus 29 degrees Celsius. In Novosibirsk, over 50 residential buildings lost heating. In Azov, in the Rostov region, residents lost water service after a major pipe burst. Even in Moscow itself, the roads are falling apart. There's footage of a highway where the road has become so icy that accidents are happening continuously, one after another. Drivers unable to stop, vehicles sliding into each other in an endless chain reaction of collisions. Some regions are cutting payments and rewards for soldiers because they're running out of money. Their budget deficits for this year were 10 times larger than planned. 10 times. One city in the Ural region, Yekaterinburg, has actually declared bankruptcy. The city government was unable to pay contractors for work completed a year ago, and their solution was to declare bankruptcy. Just like Michael Scott in that episode of The Office, except this is real life and there are actual consequences. The Kuzbas region may be next. Workers there haven't been paid in months. Unpaid wages have exceeded 500 million rubles, approximately $4 million. The blackout crisis when the lights go out. And then there are the blackouts. If you look at a map of electricity outages in Russia, you'll see that large portions of the country, especially in the east and north, are experiencing regular power failures. And here's the thing, most of these blackouts are not the result of Ukrainian attacks. They're the result of infrastructure failure. In 2024, the Kremlin canceled more than 24 maintenance and modernization projects at power plants and other critical infrastructure. Why? Lack of funds. All that money went to the war instead. Most of these power plants were built during the late Soviet era. They're reaching the end of their operational lives. Russian industry cannot manufacture new gas turbines fast enough to replace them. Russia recently signed contracts with Iran to help address the shortage, but Iran is experiencing its own power crisis. So that's not going to work out very well. And what are Kremlin officials doing while all of this is happening? They're blaming Europe. Russia's foreign minister literally said that the problem with the European economy is that they imposed sanctions on Russia starting in 2014, and that European markets have suffered huge damage from Russian countermeasures. Never mind that Russia chose to invade Ukraine twice. Never mind that Russia chose to escalate and expand the conflict. According to the Kremlin, this is all Europe's fault for having the nerve to object to military aggression. Meanwhile, the Russian parliament has proposed that Russians may not be allowed to retire until they die. If there's any sign that the Russian economy is doing great, surely that's it, right? The incentive problem, why nobody cares. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention in Western coverage of Russia, and it's absolutely critical to understanding why this situation is so terrible. The reward structure of Russian local government is completely broken. Local officials, mayors, regional administrators, all the people who are supposed to be serving their communities, they're not elected by the people they govern. After gaining power, Putin changed the Russian constitution so that he appoints these officials. That means a mayor doesn't need to care what the local residents think about garbage collection or road maintenance or heating or anything else. The mayor doesn't answer to the voters. The mayor answers to Putin. There was a recent incident that perfectly shows this. A deputy mayor in Rostov accused local residents of being toxic because they complained about garbage not being picked up from their streets. Think about that. Residents complained about a basic city service failure, and the response from their own government was to call them toxic. Charlie Munger, the late investor and Warren Buffett's longtime partner, had a famous saying, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." In Russia, nobody is rewarded to improve the lives of ordinary Russians. Local officials are rewarded to please Putin, and Putin is rewarded to win his war in Ukraine regardless of the domestic cost. That's why the system doesn't work. That's why infrastructure crumbles while officials do nothing. That's why regional budgets collapse while money flows to military operations. The entire government structure is oriented toward one man's objectives, and those objectives do not include the welfare of Russian citizens outside of Moscow. The historical echo when empires crack. If you know your history, you might be experiencing a sense of déjà vu right now, because this is how empires fall apart. Not all at once in a dramatic collapse, but slowly from the edges inward as the center loses the ability to provide basic services and security to the regions. And as regional populations start to question why they should remain part of a political system that clearly doesn't value them. The Soviet Union didn't collapse because of a military defeat. It collapsed because the system stopped working. It collapsed because the people in the regions looked around and said, "What are we getting out of this arrangement?" It collapsed because maintaining the illusion of unity became more costly than allowing separation. Russia has always been fundamentally an empire held together by force and money. When the force is redirected elsewhere and the money runs out, what's left? When the regions realize that Moscow is willing to sacrifice them for its own security, what holds them in the Federation? These are not theoretical questions anymore. These are questions being asked right now in Chechnya, in Yakutia, in Kuzbas, in regions across Russia's huge territory. The Ukrainian calculation, pressure where it matters. And this brings us back to Ukraine because Ukrainian military planners understand all of this. They understand that Putin has created weaknesses. They understand that striking targets in Chechnya isn't just about destroying military buildings, though that matters. It's about exposing the fact that Putin cannot protect these regions. It's about forcing populations that already have historical complaints to face the reality that their relationship with Moscow is one-sided and unfair. Ukraine doesn't need to defeat Russia militarily in the traditional sense. Ukraine needs to impose costs high enough that Russia's internal problems become impossible to manage. And right now, those costs are growing. Every drone strike in an undefended region is a message. Every unpaid worker is a source of anger. Every blackout, every heating failure, every city service collapse is evidence that the system isn't working. Putin made a bet that he could continue a major war while maintaining domestic stability. That bet is looking increasingly questionable. What comes next? So where does this go? That's the question everyone should be asking because the path forward is deeply uncertain. The optimistic scenario is that Ukraine continues to impose costs, that Western support continues to flow, and that eventually the internal pressures on Russia become too great to continue the war effort. The war ends not with a dramatic battlefield victory, but with Russia's inability to continue fighting while also holding its own country together. The pessimistic scenario is that Putin, faced with growing domestic challenges, doubles down. That he becomes more controlling, more brutal, more willing to sacrifice his own population to maintain his grip on power. That he escalates rather than backing down because he believes his political survival depends on victory in Ukraine. The wildcard scenario is that the regions actually start to break away, that Chechnya or other independent republics decide that the cost of remaining in the Russian Federation exceeds the benefits. That's a scenario that could spiral in unpredictable and potentially very dangerous directions. What's clear is that we're watching something historically important unfold. The Russian Federation, as currently set up, is under stress in ways it hasn't experienced since the 1990s. And unlike the 1990s, when Russia was transitioning from the Soviet system and there was at least the possibility of reform and working with the West, there's no obvious path forward now. Putin has burned those bridges. The war in Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine. It never was. It's about the entire post-Cold War order, about whether might makes right in the 21st century, about whether international borders mean anything. But it's also about the fundamental stability of the Russian state itself. And right now, that stability is very much in question. The drone strikes in Grozny are not just military operations. They're proof of concept. They're demonstrations that the emperor has no clothes, that Putin's regime cannot deliver on its most basic promises to its own citizens. And people notice these things. People remember. That's what should concern Putin most of all, not the loss of military equipment or the tactical setbacks, but the fact that with every infrastructure failure, every unpaid wage, every undefended city, the people in Russia's regions are doing the math. They're calculating whether this arrangement still works for them. And increasingly, the answer appears to be no. That's the nightmare scenario for Putin, not that he loses in Ukraine, though that would be bad enough for him personally, but that he wins in Ukraine at such cost, that he loses Russia itself. And right now, that's not a hypothetical. That's a possibility we need to take seriously.